London, 1838. The crystal chandeliers of Ashford House cast their merciless light across the ballroom, illuminating silk gowns and jewelled throats with equal indifference. It was the opening night of the season, and London's elite had gathered like circling ravens, each seeking their place in the elaborate hierarchy that governed their world. The orchestra played a waltz that nobody truly heard, for the real music of the evening came from whispered judgments and carefully veiled insults exchanged behind ivory fans. Genevieve Blackmore stood near the terrace doors, a position she had learned to occupy with practiced ease. Not quite inside, not quite outside, a liminal space that reflected her status perfectly. Her gown, though well made, lacked the elaborate embellishments that marked true wealth. Her neck bore no ancestral diamonds, no rubies passed down through generations of titled mothers. She possessed something far more dangerous in this glittering arena: intelligence without protection, beauty without pedigree. She had come to London 3 months prior, accompanying her distant cousin, Lady Margaret Ashford, who had taken pity on her after Genevieve's father, a country gentleman of modest means, had died, leaving nothing but debts and faded hopes. Margaret's charity had its limits, however, and those limits were clearly demarcated by the invisible boundaries of the ballroom. Genevieve could attend, but she could not truly participate. She could observe, but she must never expect to be seen. Across the vast expanse of polished marble, Julian Montclair, the Duke of Ashbourne, accepted another glass of champagne from a passing footman with the bored elegance of a man who had attended 1,000 such gatherings and found each more tiresome than the last. At 32, he possessed the kind of masculine beauty that made debutantes stumble over their practiced curtsies. Dark hair that fell just slightly too long to be entirely proper, grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every weakness, and a mouth that rarely smiled but devastated when it did. He had inherited his title at 21, along with 5 estates, a banking fortune, and the burden of expectations that came with being one of England's most eligible bachelors. For 11 years, he had deflected marriage-minded mamas with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, citing responsibilities that always seemed more pressing than securing an heir. The truth, though he would never speak it aloud, was simpler and more damning. He had yet to meet a woman who interested him beyond the superficial games their world demanded. "Your Grace, might I present my daughter, Miss Caroline Hartwell?" A woman in purple silk materialized at his elbow, propelling a nervous blonde girl forward like a sacrifice to an ancient god. Julian executed a bow with mechanical precision. "Miss Hartwell, a pleasure." The girl blushed and stammered something about the weather, her mother's grip on her arm tightening with each awkward syllable. He endured the ritual exchange with the patience of long practice, already calculating his escape route to the card room where he might find genuine conversation among men who didn't view him as a prize to be won. But then he heard it, the particular quality of silence that descends when cruelty finds its target. Near the terrace doors, a small circle had formed around Genevieve Blackmore. Lady Rosamond Ellery stood at its centre, resplendent in emerald silk that matched her calculating eyes. She was the daughter of an earl, possessed of impeccable lineage and the kind of blonde beauty that painters immortalized on canvas. She had also spent the past 3 seasons waiting for Julian Montclair to notice her, growing more desperate with each passing year. "My dear Miss Blackmore," Rosamond's voice carried that particular sweetness that always preceded poison. "What an unusual gown! Did you make it yourself? How very resourceful." The circle tightened. Several young women tittered behind their fans, recognizing the performance about to unfold. Genevieve stood perfectly still, her dark eyes revealing nothing even as color rose in her cheeks. She understood the game being played, understood that any response would be used against her. "I confess I find it admirable," Rosamond continued, warming to her subject. "This determination to attend events where one has no proper introduction, no family of consequence to support one's presence. Such courage in the face of obvious deficiency." "Lady Rosamond," Genevieve's voice was quiet but steady. "I attend as Lady Margaret's guest." "Yes, dear Lady Margaret and her charitable impulses." Rosamond's laugh was light and deadly. "Always collecting strays. Though one must wonder at the wisdom of bringing someone so obviously ill-suited to society into such elevated company." Julian had begun moving before he consciously decided to intervene. Something in the set of Genevieve's shoulders, the way she refused to lower her eyes despite the humiliation being heaped upon her, struck him with unexpected force. He had watched countless young women navigate these treacherous social waters, had seen them employ tears, vapors, or strategic retreats. This woman did none of those things. She simply stood, enduring, as if she had already decided that survival mattered more than dignity. Perhaps, Lady Celeste Worthington joined Rosamond's assault with obvious glee, it would be kinder to explain to Miss Blackmore that these gatherings are meant for those of breeding and consequence. It's not her fault, after all, that she simply doesn't belong. Indeed, Rosamond delivered her final stroke with surgical precision. She is nobody, really. A phantom haunting the edges of our world, hoping to be noticed by someone who matters. The words hung in the perfumed air like an executioner's blade. Several people glanced at Genevieve, with the idle curiosity one might afford a painting with a crack in its canvas, noting the flaw, then moving on to more perfect specimens. The orchestra continued playing. Somewhere in the ballroom a woman laughed. The world turned, indifferent to one woman's destruction. Julian stepped into the circle with the absolute authority that came from a dozen generations of ducal blood. The crowd parted instinctively, conversations dying mid-sentence as his presence registered. He had cultivated this power carefully over the years, the ability to command a room without raising his voice, to freeze social climbers with a glance, to make or break reputations with a single word. "Lady Rosamond," his voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "What an interesting perspective you offer." Rosamond's face lit with triumph. She had captured his attention, drawn him into her orbit. Surely this was the moment he would acknowledge their connection, perhaps even defend her clever wit. "Your Grace, I was merely revealing the poverty of your own character." He smiled, and the temperature in the circle dropped perceptibly. "How generous of you to provide such clear illustration." The shock rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Several women gasped audibly. Lady Rosamond's face transformed from triumph to confusion to dawning horror in the space of heartbeats. Julian turned to Genevieve, who had remained perfectly still throughout the exchange. Her dark eyes met his with something he couldn't immediately identify. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of fierce, burning intelligence that suggested she saw far more than most people credited. She was, he realized with sudden clarity, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the symmetrical features society prized. Her beauty came from somewhere deeper, more dangerous, from strength forged in adversity, from pride that refused to break, despite having every reason to shatter. "Miss Blackmore," he extended his hand with absolute formality, "would you honor me with this dance?" Time seemed to suspend its forward motion. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, watching this impossible tableau unfold. Down a duke, not merely any duke, but Julian Montclair, the most sought-after bachelor in England, had just publicly humiliated Lady Rosamond Ellery and requested a dance with a woman of no consequence. Genevieve stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a serpent coiled to strike. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what accepting would mean. This was not kindness. This was a declaration of war against the social order, and she would stand at its center, vulnerable to every attack that followed. "Your Grace," she said softly, "you need not—" "I never do anything out of need," he interrupted, his grey eyes holding hers with unexpected intensity. "Only want, and I want this dance, Miss Blackmore, unless you would deny me." The challenge hung between them, loaded with implications that extended far beyond a simple waltz. She could refuse, maintaining her careful invisibility, or she could accept and step fully into the light, where every flaw would be magnified, every misstep judged. But as she looked at him, she saw something that surprised her: genuine interest, unfeigned curiosity, and beneath it all a kind of loneliness that matched her own. She placed her hand in his. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through Julian's carefully maintained composure. Her hand was warm through her glove, smaller than he had anticipated, but her grip was firm. He led her onto the dance floor with the measured steps of formal protocol, acutely aware of every eye tracking their progress. The orchestra, sensing the dramatic shift in the evening's tenor, began a new waltz, something slower, more intimate than the previous selection. As they assumed the proper position, Julian felt the subtle tension in her frame. She was nervous, he realized, though she hid it admirably. "You dance?" he asked, more to ease her discomfort than from any real doubt. "My mother insisted upon lessons," Genevieve replied, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Before the money ran out, before the creditors came, before we learned that genteel poverty is still poverty with a slightly better address." Her candor startled him. Women in his sphere spoke in carefully constructed euphemisms, layering meaning beneath social niceties. This woman met his eyes and spoke truth without apology. "Then let us give them something to discuss," he said, and began to lead her through the steps. She moved with natural grace, following his lead with an ease that suggested genuine skill, rather than merely adequate instruction. They swept across the floor in perfect synchronization, and Julian found himself studying her face in a way he hadn't examined a woman in years. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark hair arranged in a simple style that emphasized rather than concealed the elegant line of her neck. Her skin held the faint suggestion of time spent outdoors, not the fashionable pallor cultivated by ladies who never ventured beyond their carefully tended gardens. But it was her eyes that captured him, deep brown and unflinching, holding secrets and sorrows she would never speak aloud. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Why did I ask you to dance?" "Why did you intervene?" she corrected quietly. "You've attended these events long enough to know that public humiliation is the currency of the ton. You could have walked past, secure in your position, untouched by the petty cruelties of lesser players. Instead, you made an enemy tonight." Julian executed a smooth turn, bringing them near the terrace doors, where the cool night air provided momentary relief from the ballroom's oppressive heat. Lady Rosamond was already my enemy, though she lacked the self-awareness to recognize it. She has spent 3 seasons hunting me like particularly determined prey, growing more desperate with each failure. Tonight, she revealed the ugliness beneath her polished surface. I merely held up a mirror. And I was the convenient excuse. There was no bitterness in her tone, only curiosity. "You were the victim of unwarranted cruelty," he replied with unexpected firmness. "I have many faults, Miss Blackmore, but tolerance for bullying is not among them. My title comes with certain privileges. Using it to silence those who weaponize their social position against the defenseless strikes me as an appropriate application of ducal authority." She studied him with unsettling directness as they continued their circuit of the floor. "That's a very noble justification, Your Grace, but I suspect the truth is more complicated than simple chivalry." He laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "You're perceptive. Very well. The fuller truth. I was bored nearly to madness by an evening that promised nothing but the same tedious conversations with the same tedious people discussing the same tedious topics. You provided entertainment." "How flattering," she said dryly. "I've always aspired to be someone's evening diversion." "I don't think you aspire to be anything other than exactly what you are," Julian countered, "which is precisely what makes you dangerous in a world built entirely on pretense." The music began to wind toward its conclusion, and Julian realized with genuine surprise that he was reluctant for the dance to end. When had he last experienced reluctance regarding any social engagement? He couldn't recall. The obligations of his position had long since transformed all such events into performances to be endured rather than enjoyed. As the final notes faded, he led her from the floor with proper decorum, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes tracking their every movement. Speculation would run rampant before morning. By tomorrow's breakfast tables, half of London would be discussing the Duke of Ashbourne's unprecedented behavior and the mysterious woman who had captured his attention. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Blackmore," he said formally, though his grey eyes held something warmer than mere politeness. "Thank you for the rescue, Your Grace," she replied, equally formal, "though I suspect you've made my position here far more complicated than simple invisibility would have allowed. Perhaps complicated is an improvement over invisible." He paused, then added with calculated deliberation, "I host a small gathering next Thursday evening, nothing as elaborate as tonight's crush, merely dinner and conversation with people whose company I actually enjoy. I would be honored if you would attend." The invitation hung between them, heavy with implications. Accepting would mean stepping fully into society's spotlight, claiming a place among the Duke's select circle. Refusing would be safer, but would also signal that she lacked the courage to follow where he had led. Genevieve tilted her head slightly, studying him with that unnerving directness. "Why?" "Because I find you interesting," he said simply, "and I'm rarely interested in anything anymore." Before she could respond, Lady Margaret appeared at her elbow with the determined expression of a chaperone who had witnessed quite enough excitement for one evening. "Genevieve, dear, perhaps we should be going. It's grown quite late." "Of course, cousin." Genevieve turned back to Julian. "Thank you again, Your Grace. You've been most kind." As Lady Margaret shepherded her young cousin toward the exit, Julian watched them go with an unfamiliar sensation stirring beneath his carefully maintained composure. Interest, genuine, uncalculated interest in another human being. How long had it been since he'd experienced such a feeling? Years, certainly, perhaps longer. Julian. His mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, materialized at his side with the timing of someone who had been watching and waiting for the precise moment to strike. She was 63, formidable, and possessed of a political mind that would have made her a force in Parliament had she been born male. What on earth was that performance? A dance, Mother. Surely you remember the concept. Don't be clever with me. She snapped her fan closed with decisive force. You publicly humiliated Lady Rosamond Ellery, not that the girl didn't deserve it, mind you, and elevated a nobody from the social shadows. By tomorrow morning, every gossip in London will be speculating about your intentions toward Miss Blackmore. Then they'll have something worthwhile to discuss, Julian replied mildly, an improvement over the usual drivel about hemlines and weather patterns. His mother studied him with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated 4 children into exemplary behavior and cowed countless social climbers over the decades. You're interested in her. It wasn't a question. The Dowager Duchess didn't ask questions when she already knew the answers. I find her conversation more stimulating than the alternative offerings, Julian allowed. She has no family, no fortune, no connections worth mentioning. Lady Margaret Ashford is a distant cousin at best, and her charity only extends so far. If you pursue this, you'll face opposition from every corner of society. The old families will close ranks against her. The marriage-minded mammas will sharpen their knives. And Lady Rosamond, the Dowager Duchess paused significantly, Lady Rosamond will become a very dangerous enemy indeed. I'm aware of the complications, Mother. Are you? She moved closer, lowering her voice so their conversation remained private despite the surrounding crowd. Your father married me for love, you know. It was considered scandalous at the time. I was merely the daughter of a baron, far beneath his station. We faced years of subtle and not-so-subtle resistance from those who felt he had diminished the ducal bloodline by choosing emotion over strategy. If not for my ability to produce 4 healthy children and manage the estates with competence, I would have remained forever categorized as his unfortunate mistake. Julian met his mother's gaze steadily. And yet you call it love. Meaning despite the opposition, despite the difficulties, Father made the right choice. A small smile touched the Dowager Duchess's lips. Your father made the choice that allowed him to wake each morning, beside someone who challenged and intrigued him, rather than someone who merely complimented his consequence. Whether that was right depends entirely on what one values, comfort or vitality, ease or engagement. She touched his arm lightly. Just ensure you understand what you're beginning here. A single dance can be dismissed as charity or whim. Anything beyond that becomes a declaration. She swept away to join a group of matrons near the refreshment tables, leaving Julian alone with his thoughts and the weight of decisions that seemed both impossibly complicated and startlingly clear. Across the ballroom, Lady Rosamond Ellery stood surrounded by sympathetic friends who offered consolation that only deepened her humiliation. She had been publicly rejected, dismissed by the man she had spent 3 years positioning herself to capture. The shame burned through her with corrosive intensity, transforming into something harder and more dangerous with each passing moment. He'll regret this, she murmured, her voice pitched low enough that only her closest confidant, Lady Celeste, could hear. They both will. Perhaps it was merely a momentary madness, Celeste offered hopefully. The Duke is known for his unpredictability, By tomorrow, he'll have forgotten all about that little nobody. But Rosamond had seen the way Julian Montclair looked at Genevieve Blackmore during that dance. With attention and focus he had never directed toward her despite 3 years of calculated pursuit. This wasn't momentary madness. This was genuine interest which made it infinitely more threatening. "No," she said softly, her mind already calculating strategies and countermoves. "This requires a different approach. If I can't make him love me, I'll ensure he has no choice but to choose me. There are ways to force a duke's hand, especially when that duke has publicly associated himself with a woman of questionable position. We simply need to be clever about it." Celeste's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "What do you plan to do?" Rosamond's smile was cold and sharp as winter frost. "Whatever becomes necessary. Julian Montclair has held himself above society's rules for too long. It's time he learned that even dukes must play by certain conventions, especially when a lady's reputation hangs in the balance." The evening continued with its elaborate choreography of dances and conversations, but the real performance had concluded with that single waltz. Lines had been drawn, allegiances tested, and the opening moves of a complex game had been executed with precision. In the glittering ballroom of Ashford House, under the merciless light of crystal chandeliers, the future had tilted on its axis, though none of the players yet understood how far the consequences would reach or how deeply they would cut. Julian departed shortly after midnight, his mind occupied with thoughts of dark eyes and honest conversation. He had attended 1,000 such gatherings and forgotten each within hours of returning home. This one, he suspected, would prove considerably more memorable. In the carriage returning to Lady Margaret's modest townhouse, Genevieve sat in silence, staring at the darkened streets of London without truly seeing them. The evening had transformed her from invisible to conspicuous in the span of a single dance. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't fully anticipate, whispered speculations, careful judgments, and the focused attention of people who had previously looked through her as if she were fashioned from glass. "You understand what you've done?" Lady Margaret said quietly. "I accepted a dance from a duke," Genevieve replied. "You accepted visibility," Margaret corrected. "And visibility, my dear, is both protection and target. The Duke of Ashbourne's interest shields you from certain attacks while making you vulnerable to others. You've gone from being nobody worth noticing to someone whose every move will be scrutinized for weakness." "Then I shall endeavor not to show any," Genevieve said with more confidence than she felt. Margaret studied her young cousin with something approaching respect. "You're stronger than I credited. Good. You'll need that strength for what comes next." What came next arrived with the Morning Post, carried on cream-coloured stationery bearing the dual crest of Ashbourne. Lady Margaret opened the envelope with trembling fingers, her eyes widening as she read the elegant script within. "He's invited you to dinner," she breathed. "Thursday next, a private gathering at his residence." She looked up, her expression caught between wonder and concern. "Genevieve, this is unprecedented. The Duke of Ashbourne doesn't issue such invitations lightly. You realize what accepting would signify?" Genevieve took the invitation, reading the words that would determine her immediate future. The script was bold and confident, the phrasing formally polite but unmistakably personal. An invitation to dinner at a duke's residence, issued directly to her rather than through her cousin's social connections, represented a declaration that couldn't be misinterpreted. "It would signify," she said slowly, "that the Duke of Ashbourne finds my company worthy of his time and attention, and that I possess sufficient courage to claim the space he's offering rather than retreating into the shadows where society has placed me." "It would also signify," Margaret added carefully, "that you're willing to engage in whatever complicated game he's initiating. Men of his position don't elevate women from obscurity without purpose, Genevieve. You must consider what he might want in return." Genevieve met her cousin's worried gaze with steady determination. "I've spent months being invisible, cousin. Months watching the world turn while I remained frozen at its edges, neither participant nor observer, but something caught between. Last night the Duke of Ashbourne offered me a choice: remain invisible or step forward. I find upon reflection that invisibility has become unbearably lonely." She walked to Lady Margaret's small writing desk, selected a pen and composed her response with deliberate care. Her acceptance was brief properly formal and utterly unambiguous. When she sealed the envelope with wax, she felt something shift inside her chest. Fear and excitement braided together into something that felt dangerously close to hope. Thursday arrived, draped in unseasonably warm sunshine that felt like Providence smiling upon questionable decisions. Genevieve spent the afternoon selecting and rejecting various gowns, with Lady Margaret hovering like an anxious butterfly, offering advice that contradicted itself with alarming frequency. "The blue silk speaks of elegance," Margaret declared, only to change her mind moments later. "But perhaps too much elegance. We don't want to appear as though we're trying too hard. The rose muslin suggests approachability, but might that be too casual for dining with a duke?" "Cousin," Genevieve said gently, interrupting the spiral of sartorial anxiety. "I could arrive dressed in stable clothes, and it wouldn't change the fundamental nature of this evening. The Duke of Ashbourne issued this invitation because he finds me interesting, not because he expects me to transform into someone else. Attempting to present a false version of myself would only disappoint us both." She chose the green silk, simple lines, minimal embellishment, a color that complemented her dark coloring without screaming for attention. When she studied her reflection in Lady Margaret's modest mirror, she saw not a debutante trying desperately to capture a duke's attention, but a woman preparing to meet an equal in conversation. The distinction mattered enormously. The Duke of Ashbourne's London residence stood in Mayfair, a testament to centuries of accumulated wealth and power. 4 stories of perfect Georgian architecture rose behind wrought iron gates, its windows blazing with welcoming light as Genevieve's borrowed carriage approached. Footmen in impeccable livery appeared to assist her descent, moving with the choreographed precision of long training. The interior proved even more magnificent, soaring ceilings adorned with elaborate plasterwork, walls covered in silk damask, and artwork that belonged in museums rather than private homes. A butler with the dignified bearing of minor royalty escorted her through marble corridors toward a drawing room, where voices suggested the other guests had already gathered. Julian stood near the fireplace, engaged in conversation with an older gentleman whose military bearing suggested a distinguished service career. He looked up as she entered, and something flickered across his features. Pleasure, she thought, though it vanished too quickly to be certain. "Miss Blackmore." He crossed the room with easy grace. "Welcome. May I introduce you to the other guests?" The gathering numbered 8, including herself and Julian, a deliberately intimate number that encouraged actual conversation rather than the performance of social obligation. Colonel Edward Hartwick, the military gentleman, possessed a sharp wit and a collection of stories about diplomatic service that kept the table entertained through the first course. Lady Beatrice Ashbourne, Julian's younger sister, proved to be a woman of fierce intelligence, who had opinions about everything from political reform to horticultural innovations and expressed them with refreshing directness. Lord and Lady Westbrook represented old money tempered by modern thinking. He served in Parliament as a reformist voice, while she ran charitable organizations that actually accomplished their stated goals rather than merely providing social camouflage for the wealthy. Mr. Thomas Pemberton, a banker and Julian's longtime friend, brought sharp financial acumen balanced by genuine kindness. And finally, Miss Amelia Thornton, Lady Beatrice's closest friend, whose quiet observations contained more insight than most people's lengthy speeches. Genevieve found herself seated between Colonel Hartwick and Mr. Pemberton, a position that allowed her to observe Julian while engaging in the dinner conversation. He presided over the table with understated authority, guiding discussions without dominating them, drawing out quieter voices while gently redirecting those who threatened to monopolize the conversation. "So, Miss Blackmore," Colonel Hartwick said between courses, "Julian tells us you've recently arrived from the country. What brings you to London's questionable charms?" "Necessity, primarily," she replied honestly. "My father died 6 months ago, leaving debts that consumed what little estate remained. Lady Margaret Ashford, my cousin, offered me residence in exchange for companionship. London seemed preferable to seeking employment as a governess in unfamiliar households." The table had gone momentarily quiet, several guests clearly surprised by her candor. Women of their acquaintance typically obscured financial difficulties behind euphemisms about reduced circumstances or necessary economies. An honest answer, Lady Beatrice said approvingly. How refreshing. Most people would rather choke on politeness than speak plainly about money. Money is the foundation upon which all this is built, Genevieve gestured to encompass the elaborate dining room. Pretending otherwise seems willfully obtuse. Those born with sufficient resources can afford the luxury of ignoring economic realities. The rest of us learn quickly that honesty about one's position is more practical than maintaining expensive fictions. But surely, Lady Westbrook interjected gently, such honesty comes with social costs. Our world rewards discretion, sometimes at the expense of truth. Oh, the costs are considerable, Genevieve agreed. Honesty marks one as unsuitable for polite company, too direct, too conscious of the machinery beneath society's elegant surface. But I've discovered that pretending to be something I'm not requires more energy than I possess. If that makes me unsuitable, so be it. Julian had been watching this exchange with obvious interest, his grey eyes tracking her responses as if cataloguing important data. And what do you make of London's society thus far, Miss Blackmore, aside from its dubious relationship with honesty? She considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would reveal much about her character and judgment. It's remarkably like a theatre production, she said finally. Everyone performing roles they've been assigned by birth or circumstance, following scripts written generations ago. The costumes are exquisite, the staging impeccable, but the actual substance— She paused, then continued more boldly. The actual substance seems rather thin once you look past the elaborate presentation. Several people laughed, though whether from amusement or shock remained unclear. Mr. Pemberton raised his wineglass in salute. Julian, you've found a woman who shares your cynicism about the ton. How delightfully dangerous. Dangerous for whom? Lady Beatrice asked archly. Society is long overdue for honest criticism. We've become so invested in maintaining appearances that we've forgotten to question whether those appearances serve any useful purpose. The conversation fragmented into smaller exchanges as servants cleared plates and brought new courses. Genevieve found herself drawn into a spirited debate with Colonel Hartwick about military reform, then a surprisingly technical discussion with Mr. Pemberton about banking regulations and their impact on common merchants. She held her own in both conversations, neither pretending expertise she lacked, nor remaining silent when she had informed opinions. Julian observed all this with growing fascination. Genevieve Blackmore moved through his carefully curated gathering like someone who belonged, not through social position or breeding, but through genuine engagement with ideas and people. She listened with real attention, asked insightful questions, and contributed observations that added depth rather than mere decoration to the discussions swirling around her. When dinner concluded and the party retired to the drawing room for coffee and conversation, Julian found himself gravitating toward where Genevieve stood, examining a portrait of his grandfather, the previous Duke of Ashbourne. He was intimidating, Julian said quietly. My grandfather. Even as a child, I found him rather terrifying. He looks like a man who never questioned his place in the world, Genevieve replied, studying the painting's stern features. That kind of absolute certainty would be intimidating to anyone with doubts. And you have doubts? She turned to face him fully. Constantly, don't you? The question caught him off guard with its directness. Most people assumed dukes existed in states of permanent confidence, untroubled by the uncertainties that plagued lesser beings. More than anyone suspects, he admitted. The position comes with expectations. Behave thus, marry thus, produce heirs thus. The actual person beneath the title is largely irrelevant to these requirements. Then why not reject them? Genevieve asked. You possess enough power to rewrite the rules, sufficient wealth to insulate yourself from consequences. What prevents you from choosing a different path? The same thing that prevents most people from radical change: fear, habit, and the weight of responsibility toward those who depend on the existing structures. He paused, then added more quietly, and perhaps loneliness. It's easier to follow the prescribed path when you're surrounded by others doing the same. Choosing differently means choosing to be isolated, or choosing to find others who've also rejected the prescribed paths, she countered. People like those you've gathered here tonight. Your sister, Colonel Hartwick, the Westbrooks, none of them strike me as conventional thinkers, content with society's limitations. You've already begun building an alternative, Your Grace. Perhaps you simply haven't acknowledged it consciously. Julian found himself smiling despite the serious nature of their conversation. You have an unsettling habit of seeing clearly what I prefer to leave comfortably blurred. Should I apologize for that? God, no. It's the most refreshing thing anyone's said to me in years. They stood in companionable silence, ostensibly studying the portrait but actually hyper-aware of each other's presence. The drawing room hummed with conversation. Lady Beatrice was debating agricultural improvements with Lord Westbrook, while their wives discussed the appalling state of London's charity hospitals. Normal, stimulating discourse among intelligent people who enjoyed each other's company. "Why did you really invite me tonight?" Genevieve asked suddenly. Julian considered several diplomatic answers before settling on truth. "Because after that dance, I couldn't stop thinking about you. Not your face, not your circumstances, but the way you stood under attack and refused to break. The way you spoke honestly when honesty cost you. I wanted to see if that strength extended beyond a single moment of crisis, or if I had simply witnessed a desperate woman's survival instinct. And what's your conclusion?" "That you're consistently extraordinary," he said quietly, "which presents a rather significant problem." "How so?" "Because I'm supposed to marry someone appropriate, a lady of suitable breeding whose family connections will strengthen dynastic ties and produce heirs with impeccable lineage. I'm supposed to choose based on practical considerations rather than personal preference. And yet I find myself thinking about a woman who possesses none of the required qualifications, but all of the qualities that actually matter." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite prepared to fully acknowledge. Genevieve's breath caught slightly, her dark eyes searching his face for signs that he was merely playing some elaborate game. But she saw only sincerity touched with confusion, as if he himself couldn't quite believe what he was saying. "Your Grace—" "Julian," he interrupted, "when we're in private conversation, please call me Julian. I've heard Your Grace approximately 8,000 times and have grown thoroughly weary of the distance it creates." "Julian, then," she tested the name, finding it felt dangerous on her tongue. "You barely know me. A dance and a dinner don't constitute sufficient evidence for the kind of interest you're suggesting." "Don't they?" He moved slightly closer, though still maintaining proper distance. "I've attended countless balls, suffered through innumerable dinners with women society deems appropriate matches. None of them ever said anything that surprised me. None of them challenged or intrigued me. They performed their roles admirably, pleasant, decorative, utterly interchangeable. You're different, Genevieve. You think rather than merely react. You question rather than accept. And you do it all while navigating a social position that would have crushed someone weaker months ago. So I'm interesting," she said slowly, "an exotic creature to study until the novelty fades." "No." His voice carried absolute certainty. "You're real in a world of carefully constructed fictions, and I find I'm desperately tired of fiction." Before either could explore this revelation further, Lady Beatrice appeared at Julian's elbow with the determined expression that warned of impending sisterly interference. "Brother, you're monopolizing Miss Blackmore. Amelia and I wish to speak with her about education reform. You may reclaim her later if you ask nicely." Julian shot his sister a look that promised future retaliation, but stepped aside gracefully. Genevieve found herself swept into conversation with two women who challenged every assumption she'd made about aristocratic ladies. Lady Beatrice and Miss Thornton didn't merely dabble in charity work as social decoration. They ran actual schools for working-class children, navigated political opposition with strategic precision, and expressed opinions that would have scandalized most drawing rooms. "Julian mentioned you grew up in the country," Lady Beatrice said. "Did you have access to decent education?" "My father hired tutors when he could afford them," Genevieve replied. "Between financial crises, I educated myself through his library and whatever books I could borrow. It was haphazard but thorough. Greek philosophy one month, agricultural science the next, Gothic novels whenever I needed escape from reality." "Exactly the problem," Miss Thornton said with quiet passion. "Education shouldn't depend on whether one's father happens to possess a library and progressive attitudes. Every child deserves systematic access to knowledge regardless of their birth circumstances. But society views educated women as threatening and educated poor children as presumptuous." "Have you considered teaching?" Lady Beatrice asked. We're always seeking instructors for our schools. The pay is modest but adequate, and the work—" She paused, her expression softening. "The work matters, Genevieve. Truly matters in ways that society dinners and morning calls never will." The invitation startled Genevieve into momentary silence. Teaching represented independence, purpose, and escape from the precarious position of dependent cousin. But it also meant accepting that marriage, already unlikely given her circumstances, would become virtually impossible. Women who worked for wages occupied a different social category than those who maintained even marginal respectability through family connections. "I'll consider it," she said carefully. "Though I should mention I have no formal teaching credentials." "Neither did we when we started," Lady Beatrice replied with a conspiratorial smile. "Credentials are what men with university degrees use to exclude capable women. We care about passion, intelligence, and genuine commitment to the children. Everything else can be learned." The evening wound toward its conclusion with the gradual departure of guests. The Westbrooks left first, then Colonel Hartwick and Mr. Pemberton together in animated discussion about trade policy. Lady Beatrice and Miss Thornton lingered near the door, chatting with Julian while clearly delaying their own departure to provide Genevieve with an extra moment of his attention. "Thank you for including me," Genevieve said as a footman brought her cloak. "I've enjoyed this evening more than any social gathering since arriving in London." "The first of many, I hope," Julian replied. He hesitated, then added more quietly, "May I call on you? Properly with Lady Margaret present and all appropriate conventions observed?" The request represented another escalation, another step from casual interest towards serious courtship. Society would interpret regular calls as declaration of intent, subjecting both of them to increased scrutiny and speculation. "Yes," Genevieve said simply. "I would like that." His smile transformed his entire face, erasing the careful reserve he typically maintained. "Then I shall appear at Lady Margaret's residence Sunday afternoon, if that suits." "It suits perfectly." The carriage ride back to Lady Margaret's modest townhouse passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Genevieve felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified, her thoughts chasing each other in circles. Julian Montclair was pursuing her with clear intention, not some clandestine affair, but open courtship that would either elevate her to unprecedented heights or destroy what little social position she'd managed to claim. Lady Margaret was waiting when Genevieve arrived, her face tight with worry that transformed to relief. "Thank God you're safe. I've been imagining terrible scenarios all evening. You insulting a duke, offending important people, making some dreadful social blunder that would reflect poorly on us both." "I believe I managed not to disgrace either of us," Genevieve said, removing her cloak. "In fact, the evening went remarkably well. The other guests were intelligent, kind, and genuinely interested in substantial conversation. And Julian, the Duke, he asked permission to call on us Sunday." Margaret sank into her favorite chair with an expression somewhere between delight and panic. "This is moving very quickly, Genevieve. Too quickly, perhaps. Men of his position don't usually proceed with such obvious intent unless—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Unless they're serious," Genevieve finished. "I know, cousin. I know this should be impossible, that I should be terrified or suspicious or both. But when I'm with him, everything feels right, natural. As if all the social barriers that should separate us are simply irrelevant compared to the actual connection we share." "Love?" Margaret asked softly. "Too soon to call it that," Genevieve replied. "But interest, certainly. Genuine fascination with who the other person actually is beneath the roles and expectations. That seems rare enough to be worth pursuing, don't you think?" Margaret studied her young cousin with something approaching awe. "You're braver than I ever was, my dear. Or perhaps simply young enough to believe that love might actually triumph over society's rigid structures. I hope you're right. I truly do." While Genevieve slept peacefully for the first time in months, dreaming of grey eyes and intelligent conversation across London in a considerably grander residence, Lady Rosamond Ellery was plotting with cold precision. She sat in her father's library, surrounded by the accumulated weight of 8 generations of Ellery power and influence. Her father, the Earl of Thornfield, listened with growing concern as she outlined her observations and conclusions. "The Duke of Ashbourne is pursuing this nobody with clear intention," Rosamond said, her voice steady despite the fury burning beneath. "He issued a private dinner invitation, included her in his intimate circle, and according to my sources, behaved throughout the evening as if she were already his duchess, rather than a charity case dependent on distant cousins. Perhaps it's merely temporary fascination," the Earl suggested hopefully. "Young men often develop brief infatuations with inappropriate women before eventually choosing wisely. Julian Montclair is 32, father, not some green boy prone to fleeting obsessions, and he spent 11 years carefully avoiding every eligible woman in London, despite considerable pressure from his family and society. If he's finally showing interest, it's because this Genevieve Blackmore represents something he genuinely wants, rather than something he's obligated to pursue." "Then, what do you propose?" the Earl asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected his daughter's answer and didn't entirely approve. "We make her impossible," Rosamond said simply. "We ensure that continuing to pursue her would cost him more than she's worth, socially, politically, personally. We create situations where her inadequacies become undeniable, where her presence reflects poorly on him, rather than advantageously. And if necessary—" She paused, her expression hardening. "If necessary, we ensure scandal attaches to her name so thoroughly that even Julian's interest cannot survive the association." "Rosamond," her father's voice carried warning, "destroying a young woman's reputation is not something to undertake lightly. The consequences of doing nothing are that I lose my chance at becoming Duchess of Ashbourne," she interrupted sharply. 3 years I've spent positioning myself, cultivating the right connections, learning to navigate his preferences and interests. I've transformed myself into exactly the kind of wife he should want. I will not allow some impoverished nobody to steal what I've earned simply because she happened to be in the right place when his curiosity was piqued." The Earl studied his daughter with mingled pride and concern. She possessed the same ruthless determination that had elevated their family over generations, but channeled toward increasingly dangerous ends. "What specifically do you need from me?" "Information, primarily. Who holds debts or favors that can be called in? Which members of the Ton owe us loyalty and can be mobilized to make Genevieve Blackmore's life in London untenable? What vulnerabilities exist in Lady Margaret Ashford's position that might be exploited to force them both to retreat from society?" The Earl rose and walked to his desk, extracting a leather-bound book that contained decades of carefully catalogued social debts and obligations. "This contains everything you'll need. But Rosamond, understand the risk you're taking. If the Duke discovers you're behind attacks on Miss Blackmore, he won't merely reject you, he'll make you untouchable in society. Men of his power can destroy reputations with a single word, and Julian Montclair protects what he values with ruthless efficiency." "Then I'll ensure he never traces anything back to me," Rosamond replied with chilling confidence. "The best weapons are wielded by proxies, father. You taught me that yourself. By the time Julian realizes what's happening, it will be too late. Miss Blackmore will be ruined, and I'll be perfectly positioned to offer comfort and support in his disappointment." She took the book with reverent care, already mentally sorting through potential allies and strategies. The game had entered its next phase, and Lady Rosamond Ellery intended to play with every advantage her family's power and resources could provide. Sunday afternoon arrived wrapped in grey clouds that threatened rain, but never quite delivered. Julian appeared at Lady Margaret's townhouse precisely at 3 o'clock, accompanied by a footman carrying flowers whose extravagance suggested ducal greenhouses rather than local vendors. Lady Margaret ushered him into her modest drawing room with the flustered courtesy of someone acutely aware that her social superior was gracing her humble residence with his presence. She had dressed carefully in her best afternoon gown and arranged the furniture to maximize the room's limited grandeur. Genevieve appeared moments later, wearing a simple day dress that emphasized her natural grace, rather than attempting to mimic the elaborate fashions of higher-ranking ladies. She had been working in Lady Margaret's small garden, and despite her quick preparation, a smudge of dirt marked her right cheekbone like an artist's accidental brushstroke. Julian found himself smiling at the sight, genuine, unpolished, utterly unlike the perfectly composed women who typically received him with calculated grace. He crossed the room and before conscious thought could intervene, reached up to gently wipe away the smudge with his handkerchief. The gesture froze all three of them into a tableau of shock. Such intimate contact was wildly inappropriate, given their limited acquaintance and Lady Margaret's presence as chaperone. Julian recovered first, stepping back with an apologetic expression that looked entirely foreign on his usually composed features. "Forgive me," he said. "That was entirely improper." "Yet effective," Genevieve replied, colour rising in her cheeks. "I must have looked rather ridiculous. You looked like someone who spends time living rather than merely existing in carefully maintained perfection," Julian said. "I found it charming." Lady Margaret cleared her throat meaningfully, reminding them both of her presence and the proprieties that must be observed. "Perhaps we should sit. I'll ring for tea." The next hour passed in surprisingly comfortable conversation that ranged from botanical interests — Genevieve had been attempting to cultivate medicinal herbs in Margaret's limited garden space — to current political debates about electoral reform. Julian discovered that Genevieve possessed informed opinions about parliamentary proceedings and wasn't shy about expressing them, even when they contradicted his own views. The franchise must expand eventually, she argued. Limiting political power to an increasingly narrow aristocratic minority, while the industrial middle class grows in wealth and influence, is practically begging for revolution. Careful expansion makes sense, Julian agreed. But giving every man a vote regardless of property ownership or education risks mob rule driven by passion rather than reason. And limiting voting rights to men of property ownership ensures governance driven by self-interest rather than common good, Genevieve countered. The current system protects the wealthy at everyone else's expense. That's not stability. It's injustice maintained through force. They debated with increasing animation, Lady Margaret watching with fascination as her young cousin challenged a duke's political positions without apparent fear or deference. This was, Margaret realized, what Julian Montclair found compelling. Not merely Genevieve's beauty or even her resilience, but her willingness to engage him as an intellectual equal rather than as a superior to be placated. When Julian finally departed, promising to secure them tickets to the theatre the following week, Lady Margaret turned to Genevieve with an expression mixing wonder and concern. "Do you realize what's happening?" she asked quietly. "He's courting me," Genevieve replied, openly despite every logical reason he should choose someone more suitable. "He's falling in love with you," Margaret corrected. "And you're falling in love with him. I can see it in how you look at each other, how you speak without the usual guardedness people maintain during early courtship. You've skipped past all the preliminary stages and landed directly in dangerous territory." Genevieve sank into a chair, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of her situation fully crystallized. "What do I do, cousin? This should be impossible. I have nothing to offer him, no fortune, no family, no experience navigating his world. Every rational consideration says this will end badly. And yet," Margaret prompted gently, "and yet when I'm with him, all those rational considerations feel irrelevant compared to how right it feels. How easy conversation flows, how comfortable the silences are, how much I want to know every thought in his head and share every thought in mine." She looked up, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "Is that love, Margaret, or just desperate hope that someone like him could actually want someone like me?" "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that it's both. And I think, my dear, that you're about to discover whether love truly can triumph over society's rigid structures, or whether those structures exist because they reflect immutable truths about power and position that even genuine emotion cannot overcome." The theatre invitation manifested as a private box for the opening night of a highly anticipated production of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Julian arrived at Lady Margaret's townhouse in his personal carriage, its ducal crest gleaming under the street lamps like a declaration of intent that couldn't be misinterpreted. Genevieve had dressed with particular care, choosing a deep burgundy gown that Lady Margaret had altered from her own wardrobe. The colour brought out the warmth in Genevieve's dark eyes and complemented her complexion in ways that simpler colours couldn't achieve. She had styled her hair in elegant simplicity, avoiding the elaborate constructions that required expensive pins and professional assistance. The carriage ride to the theatre passed in comfortable conversation about the play itself. Julian expressed his appreciation for Shakespeare's wit, while admitting he found the bard's romantic comedies occasionally frustrating in their predictable resolutions. Genevieve countered that predictability served a purpose, offering audiences the comfort of knowing that despite misunderstandings and machinations, love would ultimately prevail. "You're a romantic," Julian observed with something approaching delight. "I'm a realist who occasionally permits herself romantic hope," Genevieve corrected. "There's a difference. Romantics believe love conquers all circumstances. Realists understand that love must navigate circumstances with intelligence and compromise, but that doing so successfully might be worth the effort." The theatre glittered with London's finest, each box a showcase of wealth and breeding. Julian's private box occupied the best position in the house, offering perfect sightlines while maintaining sufficient privacy for conversation. As he escorted Genevieve and Lady Margaret to their seats, every eye in the theatre tracked their progress with undisguised interest. Lady Rosamond Ellery occupied a box directly across from theirs, positioned to observe Julian's every move. She had dressed in her most spectacular gown, white silk embroidered with silver thread that caught the light with each calculated breath. Beside her sat Lady Celeste and several other young women who formed her particular circle of influence. "She's watching us," Genevieve observed quietly once they were seated. Julian didn't need to ask who. "Let her watch. I've spent years accommodating society's expectations about whom I should favor with my attention. So I'm done performing for audiences who mistake breeding for character." The play began, drawing the theatre's attention toward the stage where actors brought Shakespeare's wit and wordplay to vivid life. Julian found himself dividing his focus between the performance and Genevieve's reactions to it. She laughed at genuinely clever moments rather than when social convention dictated, her appreciation unfiltered by the need to appear sophisticated. During the intermission, she engaged him in spirited debate about Beatrice's character, and whether her eventual capitulation to Benedict represented genuine emotional evolution or merely succumbing to social pressure. "She maintains her wit throughout," Genevieve argued. "Her acceptance of Benedict comes not from being broken down, but from recognizing that partnership with an equal might enhance rather than diminish her. That's not capitulation, it's strategic alliance." "But she does conform," Julian countered. "She enters the very institution of marriage she spent the entire play mocking. Doesn't that suggest society's pressure ultimately overwhelmed her resistance? Or perhaps she distinguished between the institution as broadly practiced, where women lose autonomy and identity, and the specific partnership she could forge with someone who respects her intelligence," Genevieve replied. "Not all marriages diminish women, Julian. Just most of them." He studied her with renewed fascination. "You've given this considerable thought." "I've had time to observe what marriage means for women of various stations," she said quietly. "For those with fortune and position, it can be strategic alliance or even genuine partnership. For those without resources, it's often economic necessity dressed in romantic language. I find myself hoping that somewhere between those extremes exists a third possibility. Marriages built on actual compatibility rather than obligation or desperation." Before Julian could respond, Lady Rosamond appeared at their box with impeccable timing and malicious intent. She swept in with the confidence of someone who believed herself entitled to every space she occupied, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Your Grace," she executed a perfect curtsy. "Miss Blackmore, Lady Margaret. What a delightful surprise to find you all here." It was no surprise, of course. Rosamond had learned of Julian's theatre plans through carefully cultivated sources and positioned herself accordingly. She settled into the empty chair beside Julian with proprietary ease, forcing Genevieve to either object, which would appear gauche, or accept the intrusion. "Lady Rosamond," Julian's voice carried ice beneath perfect politeness, "I don't recall inviting you to join us." "Surely you don't mind," she replied with manufactured sweetness. "We're such old friends, after all, and I simply had to tell you about the most intriguing rumor I heard this afternoon." Warning bells sounded in Genevieve's mind, but she remained perfectly still, her face composed despite the dread pooling in her stomach. You know how society gossips, Rosamond continued, her voice pitched to carry just far enough to reach neighbouring boxes. Someone mentioned that Miss Blackmore's father didn't simply die leaving debts. Apparently there were questions about how those debts were incurred. Gambling, they said. Cards played with men of questionable character in establishments no gentleman should frequent. The accusation landed like poison, designed to taint Genevieve's respectability through association with her father's alleged misconduct. In their world, a woman bore responsibility for her male relatives' behavior, their sins becoming her stains regardless of her own actions. "How fascinating that you traffic in unverified gossip," Julian said, his tone dropping several degrees colder. "I had thought better of you, Lady Rosamond, but apparently I was mistaken." "I merely thought Miss Blackmore should know what people are saying," Rosamond replied with false concern, "so she might prepare herself for the inevitable questions about her family's character. After all, when one moves in elevated circles, one's background naturally becomes subject to scrutiny." Genevieve felt the walls closing in, the familiar sensation of being judged and found wanting by standards designed to exclude her. But she had faced worse than Rosamond Ellery's calculated cruelty, had survived losses and humiliations that would have broken weaker spirits. "My father made many mistakes," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the emotional cost. "He gambled poorly, trusted unwisely, and died leaving me to manage the consequences. I don't pretend otherwise, Lady Rosamond. I've never claimed perfect lineage or unblemished family history. But my father's failures don't define my character any more than your immaculate breeding defines yours. Though I suspect, if we examined behavior rather than accidents of birth, we might reach uncomfortable conclusions about whose character demonstrates actual worth." The nearby boxes had gone silent, audiences now divided between the stage performance and the far more compelling drama unfolding in the Duke of Ashbourne's private box. Rosamond's face flushed with anger at being challenged so directly, her carefully constructed attack turning against her. "How dare you? How dare I speak honestly?" Genevieve interrupted, something inside her finally snapping after months of careful deference. "How dare I refuse to apologize for circumstances beyond my control? You came here to humiliate me, Lady Rosamond, to remind me that I don't belong in this box, in this theatre, in your world. But here's what you failed to understand. I stopped seeking your world's approval the moment I realized it was neither freely given nor honestly earned. You can whisper and plot and spread whatever rumors bring you satisfaction. My worth doesn't depend on your judgment." Julian was staring at her with something approaching awe, his grey eyes bright with emotions he couldn't entirely name. This was the woman he'd glimpsed during that first dance, fierce, unbreakable, refusing to be diminished by those who wielded social position like weapons. "Lady Rosamond," he said with absolute finality, "you are no longer welcome in this box. Please remove yourself before I have security escort you out." The public dismissal stunned everyone within hearing. A duke didn't simply eject a lady from his private box. The social implications rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Rosamond stood frozen, her face cycling through shock, humiliation, and murderous rage, before she finally gathered her dignity and swept from the box with as much grace as circumstances allowed. The second act began, but Julian found himself unable to focus on the stage. His mind was occupied entirely by the woman sitting beside him, who had just demonstrated more courage in 3 minutes than most people showed in lifetimes. When the play concluded and the audience erupted in applause, he made a decision that would change everything. "Genevieve," he said quietly as the theatre began emptying, "will you walk with me in the lobby? Lady Margaret, perhaps you might allow us a few moments of chaperoned conversation in a public space." Margaret understood what he was asking, permission to speak privately despite being surrounded by society's watchful eyes. She nodded slowly, her expression mixing hope and trepidation. The theatre's grand lobby blazed with light, its marble floors reflecting the glittering crowd like a mirror. Julian guided Genevieve to a relatively quiet alcove where they could speak without being overheard, though countless eyes tracked their every movement. "What you did tonight," he began, then paused, searching for words adequate to what he felt. "Genevieve, you stood against Lady Rosamond's calculated attack with a combination of honesty and strength that I've never witnessed. You didn't hide behind polite fiction or beg for mercy. You claimed your worth despite every disadvantage. I was tired of apologizing for existing, she said simply. Tired of making myself smaller, so others might feel larger. If that costs me whatever tenuous social position I've managed to claim, so be it. At least I'll have my self-respect. It won't cost you anything, Julian said with absolute certainty, because I'm going to ensure that society understands exactly how highly I value you. He took her hand, a gesture that sent shockwaves through the watching crowd. In their world, such public displays of affection were reserved for engagements, for promises made and commitments declared before witnesses. Julian, Genevieve breathed, understanding the implications. You can't. I can, he interrupted gently. And I am. Genevieve Blackmore, I am formally declaring my intention to court you with marriage as my explicit goal. I'm telling you this in the most public venue possible so there can be no misunderstanding about my sincerity or your position. You are not some temporary fascination or charitable project. You are the woman I want beside me, the person whose intelligence and courage and honesty I value above every conventional consideration society might raise in objection. The lobby had gone utterly silent, hundreds of people now openly staring at the unfolding scene. This was scandal and romance combined, the kind of moment that would be discussed in drawing rooms for years. But your family, Genevieve protested weakly. The expectations placed on your position. My mother likes you, Julian said with a slight smile. She told me after that first dinner that you were the first woman I'd shown interest in who possessed actual substance. My sister has already begun scheming to include you in her education reform work. As for the rest of my family and society's expectations, he paused, his expression hardening slightly. They will accommodate themselves to my choice, or they will find their influence with me considerably diminished. You're asking me to become your duchess, Genevieve said slowly, the full weight of what he was offering finally settling over her. To step into a role I'm entirely unprepared for, to face opposition from every corner of society, to risk becoming the scandal that defines your tenure as duke. I'm asking you to marry me, Julian corrected. Everything else, the title, the responsibilities, the social complications, we'll navigate together. But yes, if you accept, you'll become my duchess, and you'll face opposition, endure criticism, and occasionally wish you'd chosen the simpler path. But Genevieve, he moved closer, his voice dropping to intimate intensity. I believe you're strong enough to weather those storms. More than that, I believe we're strong enough together to prove that character matters more than breeding, that genuine partnership can flourish despite social disapproval, and that love, if we're brave enough to claim it, might actually triumph over the rigid structures designed to prevent it. Tears had begun sliding down Genevieve's cheeks, though whether from joy or fear or overwhelming emotion, she couldn't entirely determine. This is madness. Perhaps, Julian agreed, but it's the first thing that's felt genuinely right in my entire adult life. So I'm asking you publicly and clearly before witnesses, who will ensure this moment becomes London legend, Genevieve Blackmore, will you marry me? The question hung in the perfumed air of the theatre lobby, witnessed by hundreds of people who would shape the story in countless retellings. Some would frame it as romantic triumph, a duke choosing love over duty. Others would cast it as scandal, proof that even elevated men could be brought low by unsuitable women. But in that moment, none of that mattered to either Julian or Genevieve. Yes, she whispered, then more strongly, yes, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed was entirely improper, thoroughly scandalous, and absolutely perfect. Julian pulled her close with one arm while his other hand cradled her face, claiming her mouth with a thoroughness that announced to everyone watching that this was no mere arrangement of convenience. This was passion, commitment, and love declared before the world with no room for misinterpretation. When they finally broke apart, slightly breathless and entirely heedless of propriety, the lobby erupted in a combination of applause, gasps, and scandalized whispers. Lady Margaret stood nearby with tears streaming down her face, torn between joy for her cousin and terror about the consequences they would face. Across the lobby, partially hidden behind a marble column, Lady Rosamond Ellery watched with an expression of pure hatred. She had lost, not just the battle but the entire war for Julian Montclair's attention, and worse, She had been publicly humiliated in the process, her attack on Genevieve backfiring with devastating completeness. "This isn't over," she murmured to Lady Celeste, who stood beside her with wide, frightened eyes. "He may have proposed, but marriages can be prevented. Scandals can be manufactured. Before that woman becomes Duchess of Ashbourne, I'll ensure she's destroyed so thoroughly that even Julian's love cannot salvage her reputation." But Celeste, for once, showed unexpected wisdom. "Rosamond, stop. You've already lost him. Continuing this vendetta will only destroy your own standing. Let it go." "Never," Rosamond hissed. "I would rather see them both ruined than accept defeat gracefully." The celebration of Julian and Genevieve's engagement unfolded with dizzying speed. The Dowager Duchess, informed of her son's dramatic proposal within hours, responded with surprising approval mixed with practical concern. She arrived at Lady Margaret's townhouse the following morning to properly meet her future daughter-in-law and assess the damage control required. "You're either remarkably brave or utterly mad," the Dowager Duchess told Genevieve with characteristic directness. "Possibly both. Do you understand what you've agreed to? The scrutiny, the pressure, the endless stream of people who will test and judge and search for any weakness they can exploit." "I understand. I'm marrying a man I love who loves me in return," Genevieve replied steadily. "Everything else seems manageable by comparison." The Dowager Duchess studied her for a long moment, then smiled with genuine warmth. "You'll do. You have steel in your spine and clarity in your vision, both essential qualities for surviving this world. I'll teach you what you need to know about managing ducal households and navigating political waters. The rest you already possess." The engagement announcement in the Times triggered precisely the reactions they'd anticipated. Some hailed it as romantic triumph, while others denounced it as catastrophic breach of social order. Invitations flooded Lady Margaret's modest townhouse, some from genuine well-wishers, others from people eager to observe the scandal firsthand. Julian weathered the storm with patient determination, using his considerable influence to make clear that insults to his fiancée would be treated as insults to him personally. Several old family friends who had initially expressed reservation found themselves gently but firmly corrected, their continued access to Julian's circle dependent on their acceptance of Genevieve. The wedding planning proceeded with remarkable efficiency, driven by the Dowager Duchess's organizational genius and Lady Beatrice's enthusiastic support. "I'll teach you what you need to know about managing ducal households and navigating political waters. The rest you already possess." The engagement announcement in the Times triggered precisely the reactions they'd anticipated. Some hailed it as romantic triumph, while others denounced it as catastrophic breach of social order. Invitations flooded Lady Margaret's modest townhouse, some from genuine well-wishers, others from people eager to observe the scandal firsthand. Julian weathered the storm with patient determination, using his considerable influence to make clear that insults to his fiancée would be treated as insults to him personally. Several old family friends who had initially expressed reservation found themselves gently but firmly corrected, their continued access to Julian's circle dependent on their acceptance of Genevieve. The wedding planning proceeded with remarkable efficiency, driven by the Dowager Duchess's organizational genius and Lady Beatrice's enthusiastic support. They selected St. George's in Hanover Square for the ceremony, transforming potential objections about venue appropriateness into celebration of Genevieve's elevated position. But Lady Rosamond had not been idle during these weeks of preparation. She had spent the time since that devastating theatre encounter carefully constructing a final attack, designed to destroy Genevieve's reputation so thoroughly that even Julian's love couldn't salvage it. She had recruited allies, manufactured evidence, and planned her assault with the precision of a military campaign. 3 weeks before the scheduled wedding, scandal sheets across London published identical stories about Miss Genevieve Blackmore's alleged activities during her time in the country before coming to London. The articles claimed she had engaged in improper relationship with a local merchant, that her father's debts were incurred paying this man to keep silent, and that her arrival in London represented escape from rural disgrace rather than mere financial necessity. The accusations were entirely fabricated, but crafted with sufficient detail to sound plausible. Names were named, dates provided, locations specified, all false but researched carefully enough to resist immediate disproof. The scandal exploded across London society with devastating force. Suddenly, people who had accepted the engagement with reservation now questioned whether the Duke of Ashbourne had been deceived about his fiancée's character. Whispers followed Genevieve through every public space. Speculation grew increasingly vicious, and even some of Julian's supporters began expressing concern that perhaps they'd been too hasty in their approval. Julian's response was immediate and ruthless. He hired investigators to trace the scandal sheet's sources, deployed lawyers to threaten libel suits, and personally visited every major London newspaper to make clear that continued publication of these lies would result in permanent consequences for their access to ducal information and advertising revenue. Within days, his investigators uncovered the truth. Lady Rosamond Ellery had commissioned the articles, paying scandal sheet publishers handsomely to spread her manufactured story. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Payments traced to accounts controlled by Rosamond's family, witnesses who could testify to her involvement in crafting the false narrative. Julian confronted her in the most public venue he could arrange, a ball hosted by mutual acquaintances, where most of London society had gathered. He arrived with Genevieve on his arm, both dressed impeccably, projecting absolute confidence despite the whispers that followed their entrance. He found Rosamond holding court near the refreshment tables, surrounded by her dwindling circle of supporters. As he approached, conversations died and the crowd drew back, sensing impending confrontation. "Lady Rosamond," Julian's voice carried across the ballroom with ducal authority, "I believe we have matters to discuss." She lifted her chin defiantly, still clinging to the delusion that her breeding would protect her from consequences. "Your Grace, I have nothing to say to you or your fiancé." "Then listen," Julian said coldly. "I have evidence, substantial documented evidence, that you commissioned false scandal sheet articles designed to destroy Miss Blackmore's reputation. You manufactured lies, paid for their publication, and attempted to manipulate society into rejecting the woman I love." Gasps rippled through the crowd. This was accusation of the highest order, spoken before witnesses who would spread the story across London within hours. "So you have no proof?" Rosamond stammered, her confidence finally cracking. "On the contrary," Julian produced papers from his jacket. "I have financial records, witness statements, and copies of your correspondence with scandal sheet publishers. Shall I read them aloud for everyone's edification?" Rosamond's face drained of colour as she realized the trap had closed completely. Her desperate gambit had failed, and worse, Julian had evidence that would destroy her social position if made public. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I want you to leave London," Julian said flatly. "Tonight, you'll retire to your family's country estate and remain there for at least 2 years. You'll make no public statements, issue no denials, and engage in no further attacks against Miss Blackmore or anyone associated with her. In exchange, I'll keep this evidence private and allow society to believe you've simply chosen rural retirement rather than facing public disgrace. And if I refuse? Then I'll publish everything," Julian said with absolute certainty. "Your family will be ruined, your marriage prospects destroyed, and your name will become synonymous with malicious deception. You'll be remembered not as the woman who almost became a duchess, but as the one who let jealousy corrupt her into criminal behavior." The choice was no choice at all. Rosamond's eyes filled with tears, whether from rage or humiliation or both, but she nodded slowly, accepting defeat. "Good," Julian said. "Your carriage leaves tonight. Do not test my patience by delaying." He turned his back on her, offering his arm to Genevieve and leading her onto the dance floor as the orchestra began playing. The message was clear. Lady Rosamond Ellery no longer existed as far as the Duke of Ashbourne was concerned, and anyone who wished to maintain his favour would be wise to follow his lead. The wedding took place on a gloriously sunny morning that felt like Providence smiling on impossible love. St. George's filled with guests representing the full spectrum of Julian's carefully curated social circle, those who valued character over breeding, who celebrated courage over conformity. Genevieve walked down the aisle on Lady Margaret's arm, wearing a gown that struck perfect balance between ducal elegance and personal authenticity. The Dowager Duchess had gifted her the Ashbourne family diamonds, their weight around her neck a tangible symbol of acceptance into lineages that traced back centuries. Julian stood at the altar watching her approach, his heart doing complicated things that had nothing to do with duty or obligation, and everything to do with genuine love. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, he felt the rightness of this moment settle into his bones with absolute certainty. The vows were traditional, spoken with voices steady, despite the magnitude of promises being made. When the vicar pronounced them married and Julian kissed his new duchess, the church erupted in applause that mixed celebration with relief that they'd actually achieved what had seemed impossible mere months before. The wedding breakfast unfolded at Ashbourne House, transformed by the Dowager Duchess and Lady Beatrice into showcase of sophisticated elegance. Guests mingled and celebrated while musicians played and champagne flowed in quantities that suggested excessive optimism about human alcohol tolerance. Julian and Genevieve navigated the celebration with practiced grace, accepting congratulations and deflecting intrusive questions with diplomatic skill. But finally, as afternoon stretched toward evening, they escaped to a private sitting room where they could breathe without performance. "So," Julian said, pulling her into his arms with relief at finally having her to himself, "how does it feel to be a duchess?" "Terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure," Genevieve admitted, resting her head against his chest. "I keep expecting someone to appear and announce this was all elaborate mistake, that women like me don't actually marry dukes and live happily ever after. Women like you, intelligent, courageous, honest women who challenge and inspire and refuse to be diminished by others' limitations, absolutely marry dukes," Julian said firmly, "assuming they find dukes worthy of them, which admittedly is rare given how tedious most of us are." She laughed against his chest, the sound muffled but joyful. "You're not tedious." "I was," he corrected. "Before I met you, I was performing a role I'd inherited without ever questioning whether it suited me. You reminded me that choosing differently was possible, that love and partnership could coexist with responsibility and duty. You saved me from a life of elegant emptiness, Genevieve. The least I could do was make you a duchess in return." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen to build something genuine in a world that valued appearance over authenticity. The path ahead would bring challenges. Society's memory was long and forgiveness rarely complete, but they would face those challenges together, armed with love that had been tested by adversity and proven stronger than social convention. The sun set over London, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed impossibly romantic for a city usually shrouded in coal smoke and grey clouds. In Ashbourne House, celebrations continued late into the night, marking not just a marriage but a quiet revolution, proof that even in a world rigidly structured by birth and breeding, love could occasionally triumph if people were brave enough to claim it. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful journey through Julian and Genevieve's story. If you enjoyed discovering how love can triumph over society's rigid expectations, we'd be absolutely delighted if you'd subscribe to Echoes of Romance. Please take a moment to leave us a comment sharing your thoughts about this story. Did it touch your heart? Which moment resonated most deeply with you? And don't forget to hit that like button and activate your notifications so you never miss when we share another captivating tale of romance, courage, and hope. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you stories that celebrate love in all its unexpected and beautiful forms. Until next time, keep believing that true love is always worth fighting for.